student of political science. It is also a popular question and a question of daily politics. This phase we entered because of the popular uprising in July last year. There are two things in this last July's uprising. The first is that Bangladesh's popular uprising in July is contrary to the global trend. Since 2006, over the last 19 years, throughout the whole world is witnessing a very serious democratic backsliding. In recent years, the backsliding has actually taken a new shape, which, according to the varieties of democracy and institute based in Sweden, they're calling it autocratization, and to them this is the third wave of autocratization. Which means it is not only the democratic countries are going autocratic, but those which are autocratic already are becoming more and more autocratic in the sense they are becoming more stringent, they are becoming more repressive. In 2024, that is last year, 45 countries were autocratizing. Yet the people of Bangladesh stood firmly, defeated an autocratic regime. In that sense, it is actually contrary to the trend, the global trend that we are witnessing. But as I said, this is one aspect. The other aspect is completely, diametrically opposite to this global trend, this success that I'm talking. Meaning that when the whole world is going in a democratic backsliding, Bangladeshis have stood up for democracy, fought, laid down their lives. But Bangladesh's experience of popular uprising is not an anomaly. If we take for the last 25 years, that is beginning 2000s, what we have seen that authoritarian regimes are being coupled by popular uprising in various countries around the globe. If we start in 2000, early 2000, 25 years ago, we have seen in the post-Soviet states, there are one after another countries have witnessed the popular uprising. For example, in 2003, it was Georgia. In 2004, it was Ukraine. In 2004, it was Kyrgyzstan. And then 2006, Belarus. In South Asia, in our region, the second popular uprising in Nepal took place in 2006. But the most talked about and discussed and significant movements that took place was in the Middle East and North Africa. That is what we describe as the MENA region. And that started in 2010. These movements we usually describe as Arab Spring, though many do ask whether it was a spring or the winter or basically summer set in thereafter. But Tunisia was the point of departure where it started. Then it was followed by Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, among many other countries. There have been major uprisings and some minor ones. Beyond the region, that is beyond the Middle East and North Africa region, we have seen there are other places where popular uprising has taken place. For example, in the case of Thailand, we saw that one in 2010. And in South Asia, it is Sri Lanka, which experienced a massive popular uprising in 2022. So when I'm referring to this last 25 years, popular uprising has taken place even before that. As a matter of fact, since 1945, that is post-Second World War, there are many instances where popular uprising succeeded in deposing the autocratic rulers. In Bangladesh, I don't need to remind anybody of 1990s movement. And if you go back before the independence, of course, we can talk about 1969, the popular uprising. In the Philippines, the Marcos regime was toppled in 1986. In Indonesia, 𝗧𝗲𝗹𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗶cie regime fell in 1999. And in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia saw the 1989 uprising. Again, back to the region, Nepal's first popular uprising, 𝗔𝗯𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗃 took place in 1990. All these movements that we are talking about for the past 25 years, or beyond, 45 years, since 1945, all of them aspired not only a regime change, but also establishing a sustainable democratic system. Regime change was the immediate goal, but they knew that the regime change is necessary because of these undemocratic practices and the institutions that have emerged. Now, we must ask this question as a student of political science. How many of these have succeeded in transitioning to democracy? In 2014, Barbara Geertz, Joseph Wright, and Erika Franz, these three authors I refer to quite often because they have done excellent work on the issue of democratization and democratic backsliding. What they showed in their 2014 study, since 1945, uprising that has deposed dictatorship, only 41% of those mass uprisings followed by democratization, which means almost 60% of the popular uprising against autocracy ended in the democratization. And this is a 2014 study. If we extrapolate for 10 more years, 2024, for example, in Bangladesh, here in Bangladesh we have seen this massive uprising and going through the transition. If we take the others between 2014 and 2020, Sri Lanka is a case in point. The percentage of successful uprising leading to democracy, and when I say successful uprising, meaning those who have succeeded in deposing the authoritarian regime, is likely to be less than 40%. So the question is, why are not all popular uprisings succeeding in transitioning to democracy? This is, to us as a political science student, is a theoretical question, of course, but it is also a question about the global state of democracy. Now, democratic transition, if we want to understand why they are not succeeding, first we need to look into is what are the challenges they face. Numerous challenges, but definitely what I would argue that there are 5 major challenges that democratic transition from authoritarianism faces. Number 1 is maintaining stability. Number 2 is establishing or building strong institutions. Number 3, addressing historical grievances. Number 4, ensuring inclusive participation. And the 5th is autocratic nostalgia. Let me try to explain those. When we are talking about maintaining stability, what I mean is several aspects of it, mainly from maintaining the law and order immediately after the uprising, to ensuring even the legitimacy of the government, which comes as a result of this popular uprising. And particularly, the question of legitimacy comes, the ones which is established for the transition phase with a specified time frame. They tend to face this question, where do they draw their legitimacy from and how would they use it? If these new transitional governments face opposition, strong opposition, from the former authoritarian factions even if not the whole party, even the factions. Maintaining stability becomes a very, very challenging task. It often offsets the endeavors of the transition government or even the new government, whichever comes. In some cases there are transitioning government, in some cases not. They immediately transform into a longer period government. Economic hardship is another question within the stability question, because which in all likelihood will fall on the marginalized people in the middle class. The experience of 25 years have shown that most of the countries in Middle East and North Africa has failed to maintain stability, leading to civil war in some instances. In some cases, it is simply collapse of governance. I say 25 years, you can actually reduce it down to 15 years from 2010. Whereas in case of Sri Lanka, it has largely managed the situation. So stability, this is the stability challenge. Second, institutions. As we all know, it's a cliche, but let me put it that robust and independent institutions are required for democracy. But a government that comes in that kind of situation often doesn't inherit robust and independent institutions. And when we are talking about those robust, independent institutions, we mean the electoral system, impartial judiciary, and free press. These institutions that are inherited by the government, which comes soon after the popular uprising, tend to be weak and corrupt, because those are in large measure defining characteristic, hallmarks of the authoritarian regimes. Now, the length and nature of the authoritarianism actually tells us what would be the shape of this institution. When these are longer authoritarian period, they tend to be weaker and more fragile, and more corrupt in both financial sense as well as the political sense. So maintaining status quo within these institutions becomes challenged, because already these are weak, they're corrupt. And if you want to maintain the status quo, which is basically an extension of the authoritarian regime, you don't want to do that. But at the same time, this is what you have inherited. Two institutions have emerged as critical element in this immediate aftermath. One is judiciary, another is military or security apparatus. They have become very, very critical in many, many places where the democratic transition efforts have been made. In Egypt, for example, clash between the Morsi government and the judiciary became a key issue after Muslim Brotherhood was elected. Concurrently, the military had decided to restore the previous order, and thus a coup re-established the military regime, from which the entire Egyptian popular uprising was intended to do. In Sudan, for example, military, although initially appeared very neutral, occasionally supporting, have played very key role. The collapse of the civilian-military partnership, which was developed after the uprising, has collapsed because the military, although it appeared neutral initially, didn't want to cede its power. They want to keep it. and plunged the whole country, Sudan, into civil war, and followed by a coup. Now, in Tunisia, military has remained on the sideline, except on security issues, and protected its corporate interests, which impeded democratic transition, although didn't derail it altogether. Later we saw some backsliding, but immediately aftermath we didn't in a shorter period. In Sri Lanka, on the other hand, military remained aloof to the changes. The other point that I mentioned is historical grievances. As you can understand, the long period of the authoritarian regime actually perpetrate injustices, human rights violation, and in many instances, that is, the autocratic regime is engaged with large-scale human rights violation. In some cases, they are nothing short of crimes against humanity. As we all know, in case of Bangladesh, crimes against humanity has been perpetrated. Now, so where there are ethnic differences in Middle East, also elsewhere, including Sri Lanka, what we have seen that ethnic or religious group or region became more targeted during the authoritarian regime. There's one dimension to it, but large-scale human rights violation is already there. So, post-uprising, the transition government, and in post-conflict situation as well, we have seen the effort of truth and reconciliation process. Now, either truth and reconciliation processes have been established, or in some cases, they have made legal reforms so that they can address the situation. What happened is this, that if we look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission globally, what we gather is this, that the result is at best mixed. In case of South Africa, we have seen it succeeded to a great extent. In case of El Salvador, it didn't. And El Salvador is not an exception. There are others. The lesson is this Truth and Reconciliation Commission or efforts, processes cannot be an exoneration of those who have committed heinous crimes, crimes against humanity. That needs to be ensured that they're brought to book. The next one that I mentioned is inclusive participation. And inclusive participation is a serious challenge in the democratic transition. Why? There's no disagreement that diverse groups should be participated, all voices should be incorporated, but the thorny question is how to engage those who have been part of the previous regime, especially those who have undermined democracy, systematically perpetrated violence, adopted ideology of authoritarianism, or systematically vitiated the process which contributed to the survival of the regime. This is, to describe it, this process, this challenge as thorny issue is just an understatement. On the one hand, you are required to become inclusive, but on the other hand, how do you make sure that those who have undermined the process, created the situation, where to place them? This is a problem that has not been dealt uniformly. There is no one-size-fits-all kind of situation. But nevertheless, this is a question that has come up again and again. Those countries which have tried to make two things parallel. One is the reconciliation, another is the trial of those who have contributed to this enormous human rights violation incidents. Last challenge is autocratic nostalgia. What we have seen as the democratization process, especially those which has experienced violence, usually this follows with disorder and instability. When there are violent episodes or large-scale violence that associated with the popular uprising. So what happened is subsequently you would see some disorders, law and order, economic crisis. Some citizens tend to long for the stability that they have seen, because in many instances, and if you allow me, I can say in most instances, authoritarian regime provides a quote-unquote stability because it suppresses any kind of discontent. Brutally, dissent is completely pushed on the margin, sometimes underground. So you see a stability. And that is what becomes a point post-transition, because some people think that, look, here is the disorder. Wasn't I better before? This is what I call the autocratic nostalgia. In recent years, we have seen this phenomena in some of the Middle East and North Africa region. Tunisia is the case in point that I mentioned. And this is a result of two-pronged thing. Number one is the campaign of misinformation and disinformation vis-a-vis the current government. And this is, all this, what I'm saying is largely drawn on the experience of other countries. I haven't talked about Bangladesh yet. Yeah. Because the supporter of the deposed regime engage in deliberate effort to resist democratic reform and undermine any kind of consolidation of democracy. So it is them who contributes to this disinformation, unless the government succeeds in countering those with fact and provide some semblance of stability or law and order, it becomes a very serious challenge. Now, these are the lessons that we can draw. As I say, 60% of them not succeeding, 40% also succeeding. So where these things have been addressed properly, then it is largely we have seen the transition into democracy. Where some or many of these couldn't be addressed properly, that has resulted in a reversal. Success has been just reversed into, Egypt is a case in point, into military regime or something of that kind, or the project into a very chaotic situation, civil war. Iraq is a case in point. But where these are maintained, even before 2000, in large measure, there will be sporadic incidents. There has been. Sri Lanka is a case in point. Or even previously, if you look at the transition, in whole Eastern Europe scenario, they succeeded to a great extent because this was somehow could be addressed. Now, how do we address this in the context of Bangladesh? What we learn from this? As I said, we are in a transition phase from autocracy to democracy. Now, when we talk about challenges in any context, we tend to describe that the challenge is for the government. In a normal situation, it's fine. In a democratic situation, however weak, fragile democracy it is, we usually talk about challenges to the government, how government is going to do it, whether government would succeed or not. But it is my argument, what I'm going to insist. These challenges that Bangladesh is facing currently, four of them, or what are the challenges, not only now, going forward, four I'm going to highlight. There are challenges for the government, of course. I mean, day-to-day governance issues there, isn't it? Police has to be on the street, shops has to be open, and so on and so forth. But those are the governance, immediate governance issues. But what I would urge, and what I would insist, that when a country is undergoing a democratic transition, as we are, the challenges to the process should not be viewed as a challenge of the government alone. Rather, where we are standing today in 2025, when we are amid the transition process, I think these four challenges are to the political class of this country. You can say, okay, even if you don't want to say political class, we can say political forces, irrespective of their political parties. I think, drawing on these, the first thing, I would say transition to a democratic system requires a peaceful and orderly election. Countries which have succeeded in transitioning to democracy in varying degrees have been successful in organizing peaceful elections. Now, the experience of transition in Eastern Europe in 1990, the Philippines in the 1980s, Sri Lanka after 2022, all bear this out. On the contrary, the entire Middle East and North Africa, they didn't. And we have seen what happened there. Tunisia succeeded to a great extent. That's why we have seen some progress in Tunisia. The rest of the countries didn't do as good. Now the point is, while the responsibility of the transitional government to organize the election, the stake is far greater for the political parties who see the election, who see the transition to ensure that an election is not only a matter of who would get to the power. The election is the first step in making sure that they are closing the chapter on authoritarian past. That's why it requires openness, it requires ability to compromise, make concession while this election is organized. Drawing on other experiences we have seen where they have succeeded in doing it, because it is not who is going to power in the next election. Timing of the election is not inconsequential. I'm not suggesting that. But 2 points are important. The first thing is to ensure that whether it would be orderly and peaceful. Second, whether the political parties can agree to a modus operandi that their behavior won't be impediment to the process and by default would help justify the previous regime's sham election, because if the process is not agreed upon, the transitional government, in this instance in Bangladesh, the interim government, will have to lead the process.
আমরা একটা গণতান্ত্রিক ট্রানজিশন হয়েছে, গণতন্ত্র থেকে আমাদের একটা রূপান্তর ঘটেছে। হচ্ছে যে গণ অভ্যুত্থানের মাধ্যমে আমরা গণতন্ত্রে ফিরে আসতে পারি, কিন্তু এটা স্থিতিশীল হয় কিভাবে হবে, কিভাবে সম্ভব সেটার কোনো উত্তর কিন্তু সেখানে গণতন্ত্র থেকে নিতে পারি। হয়তো নেতৃত্বের ভূমিকা গুরুত্বপূর্ণ, আমি অস্বীকার করছি না, কিন্তু সুতরাং আমি মনে করি যে বাংলাদেশে গণতন্ত্রের উত্তরণের জন্য যে আনসার্টেনিটি আমাদের, কিন্তু আমরা সেই গণতান্ত্রিক রূপান্তর অর্থাৎ গণতন্ত্রকে করার জন্য আমি মনে করি যে কোনো সিঙ্গেল অ্যাক্টর রূপে নির্ভরশীল না হয়ে আমাদের যেতে হবে। এটাই হচ্ছে গণ অভ্যুত্থান থেকে
role of grassroots youth movements in shaping state reforms.
My presentation topics from protest to constitution. আমি আলোচনা বা গবেষণায় দেখার চেষ্টা করেছি জুলাই গণঅভ্যুত্থানের ইউথ মুভমেন্টের পরে রাষ্ট্র সংস্কার, পলিসি সংস্কার বা সংবিধান রাষ্ট্রে এভাবে আমরা দেখতাম এবং মোবিলাইজেশনে বিভিন্ন ধরনের ক্যাটাগরিতে বিভিন্ন লিটারেচারে আমরা দেখতে পাই যে ইউথ মুভমেন্টটা চাচ্ছি বা দেখার চেষ্টা করছি যে ট্রেসিং হাউ ইউথ মুভ ফ্রম প্রোটেস্ট টু রিফর্ম, integrating mobilization digital uprising countries, focus করেছি youth shift from protest to policy, data use করেছি 30+ interview, observation, documents, social media. That is evolving. Youth are engaged, protest, policy consultation in Sudan transitional input ছিল but military insurgents barrier ছিল.
অনেক ধন্যবাদ।